What would you do for power? What would you give up for love and for a chance to change your future? Those questions sound dramatic, but in the making Delta Vietnam, they weren't just ideas, they turned into real choices. Real crimes. And the answers people gave were darker than anything you would expect. Today's case is about fear, superstition, and how one man convinced an entire community that he wasn't just human. He was a sorcerer, someone who could heal the sick, cast love spells, and even make himself bulletproof. This is the case of Pham Van Tuong. It began with a scream that never made a sound. Late May 2000, on one ordinary day in Making Delta, a woman named Judio was tending her ducks and geese on a strip of muddy land. The floods had turned the Dong Tamui into a vast, endless sea, leaving only scattered islets above the water. On one of those islets, Yutao pushed the oar of her boat into the earth to scratch an itch. The ground gave way too easily. She pressed again, and this time the oar struck something solid. Not a root, not a rock. So curious, she scraped out the soil with her hands. And that is when she froze. A mouth, a human mouth, perfectly intact, twisted open in a silent scream. Her cries brought her neighbor, Chow Vanya, known locally as Numnia. He came running, and together on their knees in the mud, they clawed at the ground until the whole face emerged. And there was no mistaking her. It was to fool the woman who went missing. But she hadn't been buried like how people would normally bury a human being. She had been planted, forced up right into a narrow, deep hole like a seedling. The position of her body looked bizarre, as if the killer wanted her to grow into something else entirely. He saw confirmation of everything the village had already been secretly talking about. Everyone knew she had gone to see the sorcerer. She had taken her boat across the canal to his shack, and she never returned, and everyone knew his rules. Midnight visits, one person at a time. No witnesses, everyone feared his power. His cold eyes, the way he spoke like a man above human law. And now her body, forced up right like some kind of offering, was buried just a few hundred meters from his door to Namia. There was no doubt. Only one man in the Delta would do something like this. Only one man had the darkness and the reputation. It was Hato, the man who called himself the sorcerer. News spread like fire and rage. Namia gathered Fung's family. They stormed the sorcerer's tiny shack across the canal. But Hai Tum was ready. He barricaded himself inside, brandishing a long knife, calm, defiant. He held the mob at bay until police arrived by canoe and dragged him out in chains. And then came the exhumation. Thousands crowded the canal by boat, braving the rain to see it for themselves, to watch as Fong's body was pulled out of her unnatural grave. There was grief, there was rage. But there was also morbid curiosity. People needed proof of evil. They needed to see it with their own eyes. And when police searched Haitong's shack, they found it on a makeshift altar sat 3 human skulls. Beside them a jar filled with hair and feathers. Evidence that this was no ordinary murder. This was ritual, and it was premeditated. To understand how Haitong got here, how he built a trust that allowed him to lure victims to their deaths, we have to rewind, because the story of the sorcerer of Machang Canal didn't begin with Chafong. It begins in the mid-1990s in Tan Town, Tan Binh District, Dong Ta Province. That's when a man named Phan One Tuan appeared, better known as Hai Tung, drifting through the waterways on a simple sampan. He introduced himself as a healer, a physician, a man of medicine. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and at first he was seen as kind and even generous. He treated the poor for free, giving relief to those who had no access to doctors. Gratitude grew into trust, The villagers even pulled together and offered him a piece of solid land, permanent home, so he built a hut on that gift of earth. And with it he built a reputation. But once he had roots in the community, something changed. People who visited more often noticed he was odd. His behavior was strange to some. He was charming, almost magnetic. But those who looked him in the eye said it was unsettling. His stare was so pale it looked like he had no pupils at all. They said he could down 5 liters of wine without getting drunk. Yet he lived as a vegetarian. He bragged about mastering something he called talisman martial arts, claiming he could vanish, ride the wind, and even turn his body into iron. And as ridiculous as it sounds, the fear he created was real. That fear kept him untouchable for years. And he had strange rules. If you wanted his help, he had to come at midnight alone. No exceptions. Rumors began to spread that his knowledge came not from medicine, but from something else, something older and darker. The rumors had a name: Tunlinkai. For centuries, people in the Making Delta had told stories of sorcerers from the Tatsan Mountains in Injeong or Talon region of Cambodia. Men who practiced forbidden rituals to create a Kumantong. And the idea was terrifying. To create the Kumanthong, a child spirit that would obey to your every command, you needed 9 skulls of virgin girls. Only then, they said, would you gain the ultimate gift, invincibility. Your body would become bronze. Your skin, steel knives couldn't cut you. Bullets couldn't pierce you. You could vanish in front of your enemies or sink into the ground and disappear. It sounded like myth, but to Haitong, it was scripture. He lived by this old folklore, and he truly believed this. By all accounts, this man was a fanatic. For 10 years, he used his image as a kind, charitable healer to hide a life of ritual murder. 10 years to perfect his methods, to practice his dark craft under the cover of respect. The skulls on his altar were in trophies. They were steps toward his goal. The reason he buried his victims upright was simple. Once the flesh rotted away, it would be easier for him to collect the skull. And his victims were always the same: young women, beautiful, vulnerable women who came to him desperate for help. And instead of healing them, he turned their faith into his weapon. The murders didn't happen all at once, now stretched out like a slow ritual drumbeat across the year 2000. Some sources say the earliest victims began disappearing in the late 1990s, and in a place like Dong Thap, where floodwaters swallowed everything, and people vanished without explanation. Disappearances were easy to explain away. People said they had drowned, run away, fall into the kind of everyday tragedies the Delta was used to. No one thought to call them murderers. But to this day, only 4 deaths have been confirmed. The first victim was Nu Yen Thiangat. She was a small trader, the kind of woman who wakes before dawn to buy and hope the Mahjons break her way. She went to the healer asking for a charm to tip luck in her favor. Cheaper buys better sales, a little edge against the world. She told her to come at midnight alone, because that was his rule. And she never came home. Investigators would later piece it together. She had been strangled, her head severed, her body hidden in the mud behind his house. Next, Femtidip. She wanted relief from the tangle of personal troubles that had knotted her life. He promised cleansing, protection, and a way to bend fate. Same doorway to the underworld, midnight. Come alone in the middle of the ceremony. The mask dropped, he assaulted her, killed her, removed the head, and hid her under the shack. Then the youngest, Lottie Nu Yen. She was just 17, a lottery ticket seller from Tan Hui. She'd heard the talk boa that could make tickets move faster, make buyers say yes. She came for that tiny miracle. He took her into the same midnight room and killed her, decapitated her, and buried her beneath his floor with the others. For months the pattern held. Lure at midnight, isolate, kill. Take the skull, hide the body close. He told believers that real power demanded secrecy, that spirits only listened after dark, and people believed him and they kept coming. And then Kuntifong, everyone called her Tu Fong. She was the youngest daughter of a widow Baotabang, who had already been through a lifetime of hardship. Fong's life was complicated. She had gotten married but didn't have kids. She tried to escape her poor island life by working in a garment factory in Saigon. But her husband, lonely, jealous and drowning in alcohol, begged her to come home sick, desperate, afraid of losing her. So out of guilt and duty, she gave up her independence and returned. But she wanted something warm, some way to make her husband better, and maybe to loosen the grip he had on her life. That's when she heard the whispers about Hei-Tu, the sorcerer across the Machang Canal. People said he could cure anything, heal the dying, fix broken love, change your fate, but there were rules. He only saw people at midnight. Only one person at a time. Fong tried once with her cousin for backup. They knocked on his door, and he came out with a flashlight. He looked them up and down and said flatly, "I work alone," then he slammed the door. Most people would have taken the hint, but Fong didn't for her husband. For her future, she went back alone. On the night of July 28, 2001, in the middle of the night, she took a small wooden boat and rowed through the dark, quiet canal toward the sorcerer's shack. She carried a pink sleep shirt in her bag. He told her to bring it for the rite. Inside, he ordered her to change clothes, and as she did, he slipped behind her and strangled her with the shirt. And she never came back the next morning. Her clothes were still at home. Everything was still there except the boat. When her family confronted the sorcerer, he was cold. "Yes, a girl came here," he admitted. "But she left right away, that's all I know." But of course, that wasn't the truth. The search for Tu Fong was frantic, but in truth hopeless. It was flood season in the delta, when the Dong Tapma turned into a vast inland sea. And it was on one of those strips of earth, just 400 meters from the sorcerer's house, that the truth surfaced. 3 days later, July 31st, was when a neighbor jabbed an oar into the soft earth and hid something that wasn't a root, and that discovery broke the spell and the case. At first, when police pressed him, Hayden claimed the skulls came from his master on Nui Sam, or Sam Mountain, that fell apart almost immediately. Under pressure, his stories cracked, and soon he admitted it all. But he didn't act alone. He named his mistress Kuntai-Te. Te was a tragedy all her own. She was once a patient brought to him with madness, treated by his so-called powers. She became his lover, his shadow, and so consumed by devotion to him. She joined in the killings. She helped lure the women. She helped hold them down. She helped bury them. A victim turned accomplice, acting on Hai Tung's confession. The police launched one of the most unusual operations the Making Delta had ever seen. His house sat on waterlogged ground. Digging was impossible, so the police had to get creative. They built a cofferdam, basically a temporary wall of earth around his property. Then they pumped the water out. And once the ground was dry, the digging began. What they uncovered was exactly what Hai Tung had described. 3 shallow graves, each holding a headless skeleton. The remains were pulled out carefully, one by one, and sent for DNA testing. The results were undeniable. The skeletons matched the skulls found on his altar, and they matched the families of the missing women. Finally, there was proof. The police also recovered Tu Fong's boat. But here's the strange part. Hai Tung hadn't tried to hide it far away. He sank it right in front of his house. And to this day, nobody really understands how he did it. Locals said it was nearly impossible for one man to sink a wooden boat in deep water without leaving a trace. For neighbors like Japhonia, who knew every bend of that canal, it made him believe that maybe the sorcerer's powers were real. The court laid the timeline bare, from April 2000 to July 2001. 4 women were lured, killed, and offered up to a ritual the killer believed would make him untouchable. And according to what Hayden finally admitted, His treatments had rules. He would only see women, and he never let them in through the front door. Instead, he forced them to crawl through a low tunnel under his shack. By the time they emerged inside, their clothes were smeared with dirt, and that is when he'd hand them a set of ritual garments and tell them to change. It was in that moment, when the women were most vulnerable, that his crimes began. If a woman came to him desperate for a child, he would knock her unconscious and assault her, telling her she'd now be able to conceive. If she came begging for relief from her husband or her marriage, he might rape her or murder her when he saw an opportunity. His method of killing was cold. He would creep up behind them as they changed clothes and strangle them until their bodies went limp. Then he shaved their pubic hair with a razor and collected it in a jar, sealed with glue, another part of his ingredients. And it didn't end there. Before disposing of the body, Hayting admitted to violating them again. This time after death, then he would bury them beneath his shack, waiting for the right moment to dig them back up. When he was ready, he would sever the head. He'd even borrow large cooking pots from unsuspecting neighbors, boil the heads until the flesh slipped away, and kept the skulls polished and clean for his altar. Skulls he believed would one day grant him invincibility. Even as the truth unraveled, Hayden clung to his power. He bragged he was untouchable, that his body was iron, that bullets couldn't pierce him, that he could vanish into the earth. When his trial came in 2002, it was a national spectacle. Crowds packed the court, reporters swarmed, and Hayden, chained but grinning, boasted that the government would never be able to kill him. When the moment comes, he said, I will disappear into the earth. And the court, of course, didn't buy it. He was sent for a psychiatric exam, and the results were clear. He wasn't insane. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was found guilty on every count and sentenced to death. The execution took place in 2002 on a soccer field in Tungkui Commune. Thousands showed up, some out of grief, others out of curiosity, wanting to see if his wild claim of invincibility would somehow prove true, and it didn't. But when that moment arrived, his bravado collapsed. The banner read, "Execution ground," and witnesses say he crumbled, had to be carried to the post. The sorcerer, who claimed he could not die, died like any other criminal. His body was thrown into an unmarked grave, later washed away by rain and trampled by buffalo. His mistress Kun Tai-te, once his patient, then his lover, was sentenced to life in prison. Her devotion to a monster cost her everything. The case broke people, especially Body Bong, known as Tom Bong, the mother of Tu Fong. She could never recover from what happened to her daughter. Years later, a traveler found her living alone on a dike in Tunway. She was blind and sick. She sat in her stilled house by the canal and wept whenever her daughter's name was spoken. When I talk about her, my heart aches. She said, I loved her so much that I fell ill like this. Many years have passed, but I still can't get over it. She died tragically, and the pain wasn't just hers. The entire community bore the scar. The hamlet where Hayting lived was abandoned. Locals burned his house to the ground to wipe his presence off the earth. The case of Haytung, the so-called sorcerer of Machong Canal, is more than just a record of murders. It's a story about belief, and how easily belief can be twisted into a weapon. The women who went to him weren't foolish. They weren't naive, they were just desperate. Desperate for healing, for love, for hope, and he exploited that desperation with a cruelty that feels almost beyond human. And that's the true horror here. Not the rituals, but the reminder that in the wrong hands, faith and hope can become the very tools that destroy us. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.